Hello, everyone, and welcome to a wonderful game from the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. This is the knockout phase of the event, and Magnus is losing for the moment. Fabiano won the first game. Magnus had a terrible piece blunder, and now Magnus is in a must-win situation. Otherwise, he's out of the event. So a lot is on the line. It's a spectacular game. Will he be able to do it with the black pieces? Let's check it out. And it's a pretty interesting setup here. You have the queen, bishop, knight, bishop, everything on the queen side, and then you have the two rooks and the king on the king side with the knight in the middle. So the king and rook are already in position where they would be if they actually castled with an extra rook on h1. So complete madness of a position. But yeah, Magnus, or rather Fabio, opens with pawn to c4, and it's almost as if you open up with pawn to e4 in regular chess. You open up your queen and your light square bishop, so it makes sense. We have pawn to b5 and pawn to c5. We have pawn to b4 and pawn to d4. We have pawn to e6 and now knight c to d3. Okay, so the light square bishop has been freed, and at some point probably the dark square bishop will as well for white, but that is yet to happen. We have knight e7, queen to c1 with ideas of bishop to a4 and the queen coming to c4. Pawn to f5, and now as this diagonal has been weakened, it does make sense to bring the queen to c4. But first, bishop to a4, it comes with tempo, attacking the d7 pawn, knight f6, and queen to c4. Now putting pressure on this diagonal, and you have to be very, very careful. This pawn can't really move, otherwise queen captures on e6, and it's already game over. So knight to d5, we have pawn to c6, and now knight to b6. Of course, you're not gonna capture there. Queen captures on b4, and now knight f to d5, attacking the white queen. Queen to b3, and now pawn to d6. So for the moment, the pawn is allowed to maintain its place. Knight f3 and pawn to g5. Fabi does have a nice position, but Magnus is playing all or nothing. We have pawn to e3. Pawn to g4 for Magnus, knight to d2, and bishop to g5. Okay, we have knight to c4 from Fabi, and knight captures on a4, offering a queen trade, but Fabi captures with the queen. Queen captures on a4, we have queen to e8, now trying to get the queen into the attack, but also getting ready to capture that pawn on c6. Fabi defends at knight to a5, and he says, all right, there's really no way you can attack me. The c6 pawn is defended. If you play f4, I'm just going to play e4. So what is there for Magnus to do? Well, Magnus finds a very, very tricky move that is very hard to parry. Knight captures on e3. And you cannot capture. If you capture, then bishop captures. You're forced to go back with knight to f2, then pawn to f4. And it's just a really, really bad situation for the white king on g1. So after knight captures on e3, we have rook to e1. This is by far the best. And knight back to d5. We have pawn to b4, trying to cement that pawn on c6, and Magnus just goes queen to g6, completely abandons the c6 pawn, and he wants to get the queen into the attack. The idea is pawn to f4, the knight on d3 is a bit loose, so queen back to d1 by Fabi, and rook to b8. Magnus puts pressure on the b4 pawn, and queen to e2. Fabi replies by going after the e6 pawn, and Magnus goes king to f7. We have pawn to b5. Now the pawn on c6 is nicely defended, and also the b5 pawn is defended via tactic. If you capture, then just knight e5 check, and you pick up the rook on b5. So what you should do here is play pawn to f4. This is the tricky idea. Because while Fabi defended the b5 pawn with a tactic, now with f3 being a threat, there really aren't that many good ways to get out of this. For example, if you play pawn to f3, then you capture, and while the knight is defended, the b5 pawn no longer is. So that's kind of the downside to that. But okay, Magnus did not go for pawn to f4. He played pawn to h5 first. We have pawn to h4 by Fabi and bishop to h4, bishop to h6. We have pawn to a4, defending the pawn on b5, and rook h to e8. Now preparing to push the pawn, open up the e file. knight to c4, adding another defender to the e5 square, and king to g8. We have castles kingside. Look at this. You have to move this rook from f1 to get the other rook to f1 by castling. But okay, you can still castle. Pawn to f4 by Magnus, and now what do you play here? Interestingly, the only move that allows you to remain in the game without being worse is queen to c2. Fabi played queen to e4, he offered a queen trade, and now his position is lost. He's already below 1 minute on the clock, but even objectively, the position is lost. But it's not easy to spot why. You have to see at least 3 moves ahead, but, you know, somewhat complicated ones to solve this. But feel free to pause the video and win the game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. If you were able to solve this, you are a master solver of puzzles. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is queen captures on e4. Okay, probably the first move you thought of. You have to do something with your queen. But after rook captures, now the real tricky move to find was pawn to a6. This is the only move that wins. Idea being that, well, if you capture, it seems like you can capture a pawn, then you're just going to lose this pawn, and then you're going to lose this pawn, and it's just objectively a much worse position. So the question is, what happens after Fabi's knight to a3? How do you win now? So I could also ask you to pause the video here, but the idea was to find this move when I asked you to pause the video when the queen trade was happening. And the move is bishop captures on c6. Magnus first included a captures on b5, which you can also do. Bishop captures on c6. And there's no way to do anything here. If you capture, then just rook to b3, and the 2 knights are undefended. So that's the idea. That's how Magnus wins the piece back, and not a lot you can do. If you bring the rook back, okay, you can defend the pawn, but then knight c3, you attack the rook, you attack the other rook, and if bishop captures on c3, then bishop captures on e4, and you just fall apart completely here. So after bishop captures, Fabi did recapture, b captures on c6. Now Magnus goes rook b3, attacks the 2 knights, and as Fabi has to give one of them back, he at least grabs a pawn while he's at it. Knight captures, we have knight captures, knight to c2, and pawn to d5 by Magnus. Chasing away the rook, we have rook e5, bishop g7, and rook back to e3, offering a rook trade, which Magnus declines. Now he's going to collect the c pawn. g3, attacking the knight, but now rook captures on c6, as the knight on c2 is undefended as well. Knight b4, we have rook to c4, attacking the knight, and knight to a6. We have rook to a8, putting pressure on the knight, and the knight to c5. Knight to h3 with check from Magnus, king g2, and now pawn to e5, as the knight here is depending on that pawn on d4 not to move, so you cannot capture, of course. Knight to e6, and now we have e captures on d4. We have rook to b3, and rook to e8. Attacking the knight here, knight captures on g7, king captures, and rook to b5, going after the d5 pawn. Pawn to c6, and here Fabi finds a beautiful defensive resource, rook to c5. And the question is, what do you play here? Again, there's only one way to win the game, while I give you a couple of seconds. Yes, the only way to do it is, of course, not rook captures on c5. If you do that, then you're gonna, well, have a very difficult task here. You are up a pawn, but you're gonna have to work very hard for your meal. But after rook c5, the move that works is rook to e4. Now, rook captures on c5 is actually a threat, and Fabi has nothing better than to either capture on c4 or go rook c1. But neither is sufficient. Magnus plays rook captures on c5. Rook captures king f7. He unpins from this diagonal. Rook captures on c6, and now rook to d3. Just pushing the pawn, and the pawn will become a queen. You don't have checkmate here, as the king always has the h2 square. But even without that, the white king will never be a part of this game. We have rook to c3, going after the pawn, and now even rook e2, just going after the f2 pawn. You could also play d2, but everything is winning at this point. Rook captures on f2 with check, king to h1, and rook to f1 check, winning the bishop on a1. We have king to g2, rook g1 forcing the king back, and now rook captures on a1, rook captures on d5, and the rook to a2 check, king to h1, and now you could go king g6 right away, but it seems that all of the squares around the white king are not available to it, and so you might run this into some sort of stalemate. But I will show you why it's not stalemate, because it's actually a pretty beautiful position. So the idea after king g6 is that you will just start checking the black king, and you will try to sacrifice the rook, because if the black king ever captures the rook, it's stalemate. The white king has no squares. So this is what would happen. King e4, rook to e6 check, king to f3, rook to e3 check, king to f2, and now you do not have rook f3 check, because if you play rook f3 check, then you can just capture it. The king is blocking the rook, so you actually have king h2, and then it's a matter of king to f1, opening up a check, king to h1, rook to g2, and after g4, knight to f2 will be checkmate. So it almost works, but it doesn't. So you can go after, you can play king to g6 without preparing it. But okay, Magnus did not know that. He didn't want to spend time calculating. So after king h1, he gave a check, rook a1 check, king to g2, we have king to g6, and rook to d2. King to f5 for Magnus, rook to b2, and that's pretty much it. We have rook to g1 check, king to h2, rook to d1, and now king to g2. Here Magnus played king to e4, and he was in this position on move 59 that Fabiano Caruana resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So Magnus wins on demand, and they will have to brawl it out in tie breaks. We'll see what happens there, but yeah. It was a great opportunity for Fabiano. He missed it, and we'll see if he will be able to recover from this terrible loss. But the way you win it is fairly simple. You will just block with your rook. For example, you start checking, rook b4 checking, e3, rook b3. You're going to block because you're up a piece. Of course, the white cannot trade rooks, and once you move the rook, then you go rook to d2 check, king to f1, and now you just win the g-pawn. You might not checkmate the white king, but you can win the g-pawn. For example, knight to f2, rook to e8 with check, king to f3. Sorry about that. King to f3, rook to f8 with check, and king g3, and that's it. So yeah, brilliant stuff by Magnus. He blundered a piece in game one, but he recovered very nicely in game two. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Back to scrambled chess for a while. We'll see how it goes. Going to cover those nicer games such as this one. I would like to thank Balfino CH, Nicolas Rivard, Eddie Sphere, Brian Pratt, and David Gasparian for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing to check upon your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.